Welcome back to the English Nook, where we dismantle the highest echelons of linguistic mastery. I'm Maya.
And I'm Ethan. It is an absolute privilege to welcome our C2 Proficiency cohort back to the Nook. Today, we are embarking on what is perhaps our most intellectually demanding psychological dissection yet. We are looking past the colloquial, frequently overused definitions of manipulation to examine the actual architecture of deception.
Quite right. The term gaslighting has become almost entirely sanitized by pop psychology, reduced to a generic label for simple disagreements. But at the C2 level, we must cultivate the nuance to analyze it for what it truly is. A highly calculated system of psychological subversion, executed by manipulative, often profoundly intelligent individuals in both intimate relationships and hyper-competitive corporate environments.
Psychological subversion. What an exceptional way to frame it. Subversion implies a systematic, undercover effort to undermine and overthrow an established structure from within. In this context, an individual's bedrock perception of reality. High-level gaslighting is never loud, aggressive, or overtly confrontational. Instead, it operates through a series of incremental, micro-linguistic shifts over the course of several months.
Precisely. It is an insidious erosion of certainty. When we describe a tactic as insidious, we mean it progresses in a subtle, gradual manner, but with profoundly harmful effects. The perpetrator doesn't outright deny your reality on day one. Rather, they gently introduce an alternative narrative, subtly framing your recollection as slightly flawed, overwrought, or emotionally compromised.
And because the shifts are so incremental, the victim is entirely unaware that their cognitive baseline is being recalibrated. The true hallmark of a master manipulator is their ability to remain entirely plausibly deniable at every single stage of the process. If a phrase or interaction is plausibly deniable, it means it can be defended or rationalized as completely innocent, leaving absolutely no definitive proof of malicious intent.
Yes, they leave no fingerprints on the crime scene of the mind. In a corporate boardroom, a manager practicing this high-level deception might quietly omit you from a critical email thread, and when confronted, state with absolute composure, "Oh, I could have sworn I copied you in on that. You've been working so hard lately. Perhaps you simply overlooked the notification." The comment is wrapped in synthetic empathy, making it virtually impossible to counter without appearing paranoid.
It is highly sophisticated Machiavellianism in action, prioritizing political expediency, cunning, and self-interest above traditional morality. Throughout this 5-part masterclass, Maya and I are going to fully deconstruct these dark psychological frameworks, examining how reality is meticulously bent through linguistic framing, and how this engineered confusion manifests in the human psyche.
As always, we will culminate our session with the word tour, where we will isolate, define, and evaluate 5 premium C2 behavioral and psychological terms utilized naturally in our discourse today.
If you are prepared to elevate your critical thinking, decode the subtleties of dark psychology, and refine your command of advanced English, please take a temporary pause to engage with the like mechanism and subscribe to the channel.
Now, Ethan, let's step directly into the machinery of the mind. In our next section, we must analyze the exact neurological and psychological weapon used to dismantle a person's confidence. The weapon of cognitive dissonance.
Let's scrutinize the psychological machinery behind this architecture of deception. At the core of the gaslighting process is the deliberate induction of cognitive dissonance. For those unacquainted with the clinical framework, cognitive dissonance describes the intense psychological discomfort we experience when we hold two contradictory beliefs, or when our direct experience clashes with our deeply held self-image.
Precisely. The human brain possesses an inherent drive toward internal consistency. It abhors dissonance. We are evolutionarily wired to resolve that tension immediately. A master manipulator understands this perfectly. They do not merely lie. They force you to resolve the conflict between what you know you witnessed and the version of events they have elegantly constructed for you.
And this is where the linguistic framing becomes truly sophisticated. They utilize a technique I classify as weaponized empathy. Consider the phrase, "I'm only saying this because I care about you, and I'm worried you're becoming unstable." By framing their critique as an expression of concern, they effectively block any rational defense.
It is a masterclass in behavioral subversion. If you react with anger, you have inadvertently validated their premise that you are becoming unstable, erratic, or overly sensitive. You are trapped in a logical paradox of your own making. The more you defend your reality, the more you appear to be suffering from the very condition they are falsely diagnosing.
It is the perfect closed loop. You start to doubt your own sensory input. This leads to the systematic erosion of epistemic trust, the fundamental trust we place in our own faculties of perception and memory. When you no longer trust your ability to interpret the world, you become entirely dependent on the manipulator to provide your reality for you.
And they are more than happy to oblige. They curate your reality with the meticulousness of an editor. They offer alternative facts. They selectively curate past events, and they consistently reward you with affection only when you align your narrative with theirs. It is a slow, methodical process of psychological recalibration.
It is fascinating and terrifying how easily the human mind can be rewired when exposed to a consistent, high-authority narrative, even when that narrative is a complete fabrication. We aren't just talking about a toxic relationship anymore. We are talking about the total annexation of another person's sovereign mind.
Indeed. But this is not confined to the private sphere. The same mechanics of framing, the same subtle undermining of perceived reality, are frequently employed in corporate settings to consolidate power or neutralize competition.
That is the next vital frontier. Shall we analyze how these high-stakes psychological weapons are deployed in the boardroom? We need to look at how gaslighting functions as a tool for corporate sabotage.
Let us shift our analytical lens from the domestic sphere into the high-stakes arena of the corporate boardroom. In professional environments, high-level gaslighting loses any pretense of emotional intimacy and becomes a weapon of pure Machiavellianism, a strategic, calculating method utilized to consolidate institutional power, neutralize professional rivals, or evade accountability.
Absolutely. In the corporate world, this deception is often institutionalized. It doesn't rely on personal insults. Instead, it utilizes institutional processes to systematically undermine a colleague's credibility. A classic example is the tactical manipulation of information. An executive might intentionally keep you out of the loop on a critical structural pivot, only to look at you during a cross-functional meeting and ask, with absolute, flawless composure, "Why haven't you adjusted your team's metrics to reflect the new direction? We finalized this weeks ago."
It is an exquisite form of corporate sabotage. The target is instantly forced into a defensive posture. If you state that you were never informed, you risk appearing disorganized, unaligned, or out of touch with leadership. If you scramble to agree, you validate their false premise that the breakdown in communication was entirely your fault. The manipulator has elegantly manufactured a scenario where you are set up to fail, all while maintaining absolute, plausibly deniable distance from the outcome.
And because corporations are inherently hierarchical, the victim often lacks the structural leverage to challenge the narrative. The manipulator leverages the company's own culture against you. They wrap their sabotage in the vocabulary of corporate optimization, teamwork, or performance management. It's the insidious deployment of phrases like, "We love your passion, but your current perception of this project doesn't seem to align with our broader strategic vision."
Yes, they pathologize your competence. By framing your accurate assessment of a failing project or an unethical decision as a lack of strategic alignment, or a failure to understand the bigger picture, they force you to question your own professional judgment. Over time, this induces a state of profound intellectual isolation. You begin to second guess your data, your insights, and your executive intuition.
You become paralyzed by your own doubt. And while you are paralyzed, the manipulator quietly absorbs your responsibilities, taking credit for your successes while assigning the blame for any institutional failures squarely to your department. It is an incredibly sophisticated, ruthless game of corporate chess.
It truly is the dark underbelly of executive dynamics. But once this psychological annexation is complete, how does the victim recognize the trap? In our next section, we must look at the systemic symptoms of this deception and analyze the precise psychological cost of long-term exposure.
Let us confront the psychological fallout of this structural manipulation, Maya. When an individual has been subjected to this level of insidious deception over months or years, the damage extends far beyond simple confusion. The final stage of high-level gaslighting is the absolute erosion of the victim's psychological sovereignty.
It is a state of total disorientation. In clinical terms, the victim begins to exhibit hypervigilance, chronic self-doubt, and a constant, pervasive anxiety about making an irreversible mistake. They spend hours reconstructing past conversations in their mind, searching for clues, trying to reconcile the extreme cognitive dissonance engineered by the manipulator.
They are caught in a mental prison where the manipulator acts as the warden. You lose the ability to trust your own intuition. When a professional or partner reaches this threshold, they stop relying on objective data and start making decisions based entirely on predicting the manipulator's reaction. Your whole life becomes a defensive posture.
And the most tragic element of this psychological subversion is that the victim becomes their own jailer. They begin to actively police their own thoughts, silencing their own valid concerns before they can even voice them, rationalizing the perpetrator's behavior to maintain a false sense of stability.
So, how does one dismantle this architecture? How do you break the loop? It requires what I call an epistemic audit. You must completely stop engaging with the manipulator's verbal narrative and rely exclusively on unalterable objective evidence.
Absolutely. You must write things down immediately after they happen, secure independent documentation, and establish external anchors of reality. Trusted peers, mentors, or professionals who are entirely outside the manipulator's sphere of influence. You cannot argue with a master of deception using their logic. You must step entirely outside their framework.
It is about reclaiming your cognitive baseline and restoring your absolute right to your own reality. And now that we have completely dissected the mechanics, the corporate deployment, and the symptoms of this dark psychological architecture, let's navigate directly into the word tour to isolate and master the elite vocabulary we used naturally during today's session.
And that brings us to the final chapter of today's masterclass, the word tour. Today, we dissected the complex architecture of deception. Let's isolate 5 premium C2 advanced expressions from our discussion to bring clinical precision to your vocabulary.
These terms are indispensable for analyzing human behavior, advanced corporate dynamics, and dark psychology. Let's dissect them.
Our first concept is the noun phrase, psychological subversion.
This refers to the systematic, covert effort to undermine, weaken, and overthrow an individual's mental baseline, emotional stability, or core perception of reality from within.
For example, the manager used subtle, daily critiques as a form of psychological subversion to completely dismantle the team leader's authority.
Word number 2 is the adjective, insidious.
Proceeding in a gradual, subtle, or stealthy way, but developing with profoundly harmful, destructive, or toxic long-term effects.
For example, high-level emotional manipulation is incredibly insidious because the victim doesn't realize their reality is being bent until the damage is already done.
Word number 3 is the phrase, plausibly deniable.
Describing an action, statement, or behavior that can be defended, excused, or rationalized as entirely innocent, leaving no definitive proof of malicious intent.
For example, by omitting the data from the final brief, the executive ensured their sabotage remained completely plausibly deniable.
Our fourth item is the noun phrase, cognitive dissonance.
The intense state of psychological discomfort or mental tension experienced when a person simultaneously holds two contradictory beliefs, or when their direct experience clashes with their worldview.
For example, the victim suffered from severe cognitive dissonance when forced to reconcile their boss's public praise with his private sabotage.
And finally, word number 5 is the noun Machiavellianism.
A psychological trait or political strategy characterized by extreme cunning, manipulation, self-interest, and a cold prioritization of expediency above traditional morality.
For example, the cutthroat corporate culture in the executive suite fostered an environment of pure, unchecked Machiavellianism.
A truly elite lexicon to help you articulate the deepest, most complex layers of human communication and psychological architecture. Now, before we conclude, we are inviting our C2 cohort to engage with us directly.
Your challenge today requires a high degree of linguistic precision. Scan our vocabulary list, select one word or phrase, whether it is Machiavellianism, insidious, or plausibly deniable, and craft just one original sentence using it in the comments below.
That's the entire task. A single high-status sentence to permanently move these clinical terms from passive comprehension to active mastery. Maya and I will be personally auditing the comment section to analyze your prose.
If this psychological breakdown challenged your perspective and elevated your analytical mindset today, please activate the like mechanism and subscribe to the channel. Your interaction directly sustains the Nook.
Thank you for your intellectual curiosity, your focus, and your time today.
Reclaim your cognitive baseline. Anchor yourself in objective data. And we will see you back at the Nook for our next advanced analysis.
Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.